I can turn on display in the viewport, and each one has got its own settings, which is pretty cool. But let's say there was a circumstance where I actually wanted all of these objects to have the same settings. Well, I can actually do that with this modifier. I'll actually instance it onto these other objects, and I'll instance it on here as well. And now they've all got this modifier on, and that means that I can actually control the size of their profile simply by modifying that modifier. So as you can see, that's actually converted that kind of functionality into a modifier, and it allows us to take advantage of things like instancing. Then if we look at this object here, it's actually just a spline, which you can see I've actually drawn in this plane, and it's a sort of outline of a wine glass or something like that. And I've applied a lathe modifier from that group, and as you can see, that actually sweeps it around a central axis here and creates a kind of wine glass object. And as I said, lathe, loft, extrude, these are all very useful tools when you're doing more sort of technical modeling. And our last object over here, as you can see, it's an edible patch cylinder, which I can obviously go in and grab these control points and move them around. But if I wanted to do that in a procedural way, then I may want to do it with a modifier, and you can see you've got this edit patch modifier on here, and that does basically the same thing. We can go in and we can edit our patch in the usual way. And next we have the mesh editing tools, and this group deals with modifying our mesh and poly objects. And for the most part, the modifiers here will allow you to go in and modify your meshes in any way you wish. And these tools, along with the subdivision surface tools, form the backbone of 3ds Max's poly modeling and sub-D surface modeling tool pipeline. You can also find very specific modifiers here to manipulate the face characteristics of your models, such as the normals, the smoothing, vertex welding, and also you can actually edit the normals. You can also use the vertex paint modifier to actually, not too surprisingly, go in and actually paint the vertex colors of our models, and that can then be used in materials as a mask, or it can be used as a texture map in its own right. One thing to bear in mind here is that the optimized modifier, or rather the optimized base modifiers, bases its poly reductions on the angles that it finds between pairs of faces. If you use an animated mesh deforming modifier below it in the stack, such as skin or bend, twist and so on, then those face angles will actually change, resulting in radically different optimized geometry coming through from frame to frame. And this can cause problems with topology dependent systems such as renderers, and that can cause problems with motion blur and so forth, and things like that. So that's something to bear in mind here. If we look at this object that we've got, it's a very, very simple demonstration of what you can do. You can see I've got a parametric box object here, and then I've applied an edit mesh modifier to it, with which I've actually selected these faces. And then I've done a face extrude, which as you can see is quite simply just extrudes those faces outwards. And then I've applied an edit poly modifier, and using that you can see I've extruded those faces out again, and then I've selected those faces here, here, here and here, and all the way around, and then I've extruded those out on top again. So you can see at each stage we're building up a model using these different modifiers to give us a different result. Now it should actually be possible to go down to the face extrude modifier here, and if I show end result, I can actually grab this value here and spin it outwards. So you can see I can actually change that extrusion, and that's been passed up the stack to the edit poly modifier. So that actually shows you've got this procedural workflow going on here with data being passed up the stack. So that's it for the mesh editing tools. Let's move on now and have a look at the animation tool. If you look through the modifiers contained here, you'll see that they are all in one way or another involved in deforming meshes or patch-based models in some way. Although these modifiers are listed as animation tools, it's actually just as valid to use them as part of your modeling workflow if it suits your needs. For instance, you could very quickly use a skin and a set of basic bones to deform your mesh into a particular shape, into a particular pose and so on. And you could use this to, let's say, model a character. Then you could set up skin so the mesh can be deformed more easily, and then you can set your character in a certain pose that your client may wish for an illustration or whatever. The main character animation tools here are Skin, Morpher, Skin Morph, Skin Wrap and Flex, with Flex actually being pretty much the only one of those tools which is just useful for animation, because it's actually based on the motion of the object, so it's not really useful for posing your character or anything like that. So to show off these tools, I've actually created a very, very basic rig here. I've got a cylinder, and you can see I've created 3 bones within it, and then I've used so I'll just run you very quickly through the stack. I've got a cylinder here, then I've got a morpher on here, which actually allows us to deform the mesh. The top one actually splays out the end of the cylinder, and the one below it actually makes the middle of the cylinder bulge. Then above that I've got the skin modifier, and that just basically brings in these bones and actually binds the mesh to those bones. And I've actually got some, if I turn off this these 2 modifiers here and I run the animation, you can see I've got some animation on these bones, so they actually just wobble around here a little bit. And if I turn on skin and press play, you'll see that the mesh gets deformed along with those bones. So you can see obviously its primary use is actually in animation, but as I said, you know, you could use it to deform the character into, say, that pose like this. Then you could snapshot that mesh and actually use that as the basis of an illustration. Now if I go back to the beginning and turn on flex, this particular modifier is actually history dependent. In other words, it depends on where you are in the timeline to give you results. What this modifier does is it gives you a sort of squash and stretch effect on the mesh, and it's based on the velocity at which the mesh is moving at. So now if I press play, you'll notice that when it reaches the extremes of its motion, the mesh will actually flex somewhat. So if you watch it, you can see there's a wobble there. And as you can see, as you move around, it's got a sort of nice soft feel to the mesh. It's actually flexing a little bit, which makes sense based on the name Flex. So that's all pretty cool. So let's move on and now have a look at the UV coordinate tools. The UV coordinate group contains modifiers that manipulate an object's UV mapping in some way. There are some tools here for adding basic primitive UV mapping, for unwrapping UVs, mapping an object based on the active camera, or even to remove UV mapping completely, which is useful sometimes when obviously your objects don't need any UV mapping, and that those UVs are actually taking up memory. I've got a very, very, very simple example here. This is the cylinder with its own built-in mapping, and let's say, you know, it wasn't very applicable to what we wanted to do with the cylinder. You know, our texture map doesn't work the way we want it. We've got this sort of funny streaking going on the top, and let's say we want to change that. Well, in this case I've applied a UV modifier, and you can see that's actually changed the mapping to be in this case a little bit more usable. Now we actually have a DVD in our range which actually covers this topic in much more detail, and that's called Texturing Fundamentals 1. That's by myself, and that actually covers the usage of procedural textures, 2D textures, UV mapping, mapping channels and so forth. So if you want to find out more about that topic, you can actually get that DVD, and that will teach you in a lot more detail. So let's move on and have a look at the cache tools now. The point caches are very specific modifiers that can be used to store the vertex positions of an object's mesh over time. It then saves them and allows you to replay this data from a hard disk or a network drive. These modifiers can be used to bake complex procedural rigs down into a simple base object, and point cache systems which can aid in playback speed and stability under some circumstances. Now in this case I've actually taken the animation mesh that we saw earlier. You remember this setup here, which as we saw flexed around and so on. Now if we had a scene where we had a number of these objects, it may actually get a little bit slow to play back. So in this case you would use a cache to do that, and I've saved out a cache file. If we go to the set cache button, you can see that if we look in the correct directory, we've got a tube cache points here.